Welcome to my video, Investing in an Inflationary Regime. Keep at least some gold. Sky-high goods price inflation is here to stay. Unfortunately, this situation is not temporary but permanent in nature, one has to fear. While central banks have started raising interest rates, real interest rates, that is nominal interest rates minus goods price inflation, have remained deep in negative territory. And central banks are unlikely to raise real interest rates up to levels that will put sufficient downward pressure on overall goods price inflation. The reasons for such an outlook are manifold. In mid-2022, global debt reached a record $300 billion, or around 350% of global GDP. Most of the debt has been financed at record low interest rates, and it is reasonable to assume that the credit pyramid would collapse should interest rates in real terms rise further. In fact, the massive debt load puts an upper limit on the interest rates central banks can impose on highly leveraged borrowers. Then there is the runaway deficit spending of many governments, linked to the aftermath of the politically dictated lockdown crisis, green policy and the associated energy crisis. The growing gap between government spending and revenue is enormous and financed by issuing new debt. Needless to say, governments want low borrowing costs, a demand central bankers cannot and will not resist. While sky-high inflation has already become a serious problem for most people, it is actually rather helpful for the state apparatus for several reasons. If central banks keep nominal interest rates below the inflation rate, government debt is reduced in real terms at the expense of money holders and creditors. In fact, negative real interest rates are a blessing for cash-strapped governments, and they will not appreciate it when the central bank introduces positive real interest rates. Inflation also helps the state to grow even bigger. Politicians will come to the rescue of any problem caused by inflation. When inflation leads to an economic contraction, the government stands ready to increase deficit spending. When inflation puts people in need, the government stands ready to hand out food stamps. When inflation makes energy and food prices unaffordable, the government rushes to impose price ceilings. Inflation, unless it spins completely out of control, is an elixir of government expansion, which means the state grows at the expense of the freedom and liberty of the people and free enterprise. And it is very difficult to stop inflation, especially sky-high inflation, once it begins. This is what makes inflation so particularly problematic. What can the investor do about it? It is fair to say that it is rather difficult to escape the effects of inflation. For instance, many businesses suffer from inflation. Inflation reduces people's purchasing power, which in turn leads to a decline in the demand for many products. That said, not all stocks will provide the investor with an inflation hedge. What is more, inflation increases the maintenance costs for real estate, which can all too easily make housing investments less attractive if rents cannot be increased accordingly. It is also worth noting that inflation typically affects different goods prices at different times and to different degrees. Therefore, investing in an inflationary regime becomes a rather tricky business that offers opportunity, but also many risks. The obvious thing for investors to do is to minimize their cash holdings, as cash will lose more and more of its value. It also makes sense to seek a broad portfolio diversification, for example, in equities, real estate, and commodities worldwide. Finally, the investor should hold physical gold and silver as part of their liquid means. The precious metals can be considered close money substitute, and their purchasing power cannot be debased by central banks keeping real interest rates negative and running the electronic printing presses. Given the current gold and silver prices, I see a fairly good opportunity for long-term oriented investors to build up and expand their precious metals holdings. Thank you very much for your attention. If you enjoyed the video, please like, share, and ring the bell. See you soon.